Hello, my name's Florence. Welcome to the OBS Pod. I'm an NHS obstetrician, hoping to share some thoughts and experiences about my working life. Perhaps you enjoy Call the Midwife, maybe birth fascinates you, or you're simply curious about what exactly an obstetrician is. You might be pregnant and preparing for birth. Perhaps you work in maternity and want to know what makes your obstetric colleagues tick, or you want some fresh ideas and inspiration. Whichever of these is the case, and for that matter anyone else that's interested, the OBS Pod is for you. Episode 164, Intermittent Auscultation. It's absolutely wonderful to welcome back Dr. Kirsten Small today. We talked to her on episode 157, Monitoring the Fetus in Labour, and we're going to continue on with that theme, but in a slightly different direction, because we're going to discuss intermittent auscultation, which is still monitoring the fetus in labour, but may not be considered that or considered sufficiently that, which is some of what we're going to explore today. So perhaps we should start by discussing what is intermittent auscultation and what do we mean by that?
Auscultation means to listen to something. So, as the name suggests, it refers to intermittently listening to the fetal heart rate during labour as a means of telling whether things are okay with the fetus or not. It is typically done in most parts of the high-income maternity care systems around the world using Doppler technology, and they're called things like sonic aids or dot tones, depending on which part of the world that you're in, that uses ultrasound waves that are bounced through the tissues, and sound waves are then reflected back. And if something is moving as the sound wave hits it, it produces a thing called the Doppler shift. So there's a change in the frequency of those sound waves. And so those devices then can pick up that movement. And then there's a little mini computer in the brain of it that turns it into an audible sound that we can hear. Plus, most handheld machines now have the same technology that CTG machines have, which will also count the heart rate for you, so you don't have to sit there with your watch on your wrist or the front of your uniform listening to and looking at the hand on the clock and trying to do maths to work out how many beats per minute it is. So those bits of technology make life so much easier, because the original and the very first form of fetal heart rate monitoring was to use a thing called a Pinard stethoscope, which is just a long cone-shaped hollow device made of wood or sometimes metal or sometimes plastic, that then has a flat area on one end to make it comfortable to stick it next to your ear. And you put the wide end of the cone on the mother's abdomen next to where the fetal heart sits. Going to have a feel and see which way around the baby's pointing first, so that you're not sticking it over its bum. And you can actually directly hear the actual sound that the heart is making. And there are some theoretical advantages to actually hearing the actual fetal heart sound and not something that's computer generated and slightly abstract. But obviously they don't calculate the heart rate for you. You've got to do that and do the maths and count the numbers as you're going, which requires a little bit of technical expertise. And it kind of limits the positions that the woman can get into, and the care provider needs to work around her in terms of being able to physically do fetal heart rate monitoring. So you can't stick your head into the birth pool.
Yeah.
Use a Pinard underneath the water, for example. You're going to have to ask a woman to stand up so that you can access that if you wanted to use a Pinard. So a handheld waterproof Doppler means that you can work. It's uncommon that you would need to ask a woman to really significantly adjust her position in order to be able to hear what's going on. So hence the Dopplers have become so prolific in use, and it's now quite difficult to find care providers who actually have, expertise in terms of using a Pinard stethoscope and using it well.
Yeah, I think so. I had not that long ago a woman who didn't want Doppler, who wanted a Pinard, and we had exactly that conversation about, well, that will be more difficult for you to position, and if you want to use the pool, that will be more challenging. Just you'll have to stand up or get out, or we'll have to adjust things, because listening with a Pinard, which definitely I did earlier on in my career, it is quite intimate. You are quite close to the woman's abdomen. The Pinard is maybe sort of 6 or 8 inches long, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, centimeters, 15 centimeters or so. So you are quite close, up close and personal. But there is something pretty amazing about hearing directly the baby, I think. I feel it's a bit sad that we've lost that.
I think it is a bit sad that we've lost that, and we might pick up back on this as we continue the conversation. Many years ago, I had a fabulous conversation with 2 midwives from North America, Oregon, who had, and the American midwifery training system is very different to your country and mine, Australia and the UK, in that there's the option to do like an apprenticeship model where you train with a midwife who works in the community, not in a hospital system. And, at the end of multiple years, when you feel that you've mastered the skill set, then you do an exam that's managed nationally. And so they learnt their skills from other women serving women in their communities in and out of hospital settings. So they'd never used a CTG machine, and I don't even know if they owned a Doppler. And so I was fascinated, like, how do you know whether the fetus is okay or not? What are the things that you use to be able to say we're fine, or no, we need to transfer to hospital, or when, we need to just, whatever, wiggle and jiggle and move, or cut an episiotomy, whatever tools they've got in the out of hospital setting to speed labour up. And because they were using Pinards, and they talked about the fact that the sound that the heart rate makes changes when you're getting up in a situation where there's fetal compromise. And I think many years later, having learned a whole lot more about fetal physiology and what's going on, I think what they're hearing is fetal blood pressure dropping. Which is really interesting, because it's not something we can pick up with the CTG, and yet it's probably one of the few reliable signs that you've gone from my oxygen level's low, but I'm actually okay, you don't need to do anything, to my oxygen level's low and I'm not okay and you need to get me out of here. So, there's maybe we abandoned Pinards too early, when there might have been a way to capture that information, but in a way that still had all the advantages of Doppler technology, the flexibility in terms of women's positions and being able to be waterproof, and, not having to be quite so physically intimate with women to be able to do the job, and have a room that's really quiet to be able to hear. If we could have achieved that whilst listening to the actual fetal heart, and it's not too late, somebody could still invent that technology for us today. It might be a game changer.
Yeah, it could be. So if we're talking about a woman in labour, and we're discussing what sort of monitoring, we talked on our previous episode about the lack of evidence for CTG, and what we were talking about was the comparison between CTG, continuous cardiotocograph, and this method, intermittent auscultation. So this is our sort of basic comparative way of monitoring the baby. We weren't talking about not monitoring the baby. So
correct. There's never been a study that's compared CTG use with no form of fetal heart rate monitoring, and likewise, there's never been a study that's compared intermittent auscultation with no form of fetal heart rate monitoring. All we've got is studies that compare one against the other. Stethoscopes, which resembled Pinard stethoscopes when they were first invented, were, about the 1820s, and by 1830s we see quite widespread use through France and the English-speaking world of intermittent auscultation in labour. The focus was more on, is this baby alive or not, rather than is it well or not, because they didn't have safe cesarean section, and so the decision was about, well, if this baby's dead, it's pretty gruesome, we can chop it up into little pieces and pull it out through the woman's vagina and save her life in the process. So it was a different world, different situation,
very different.
And our modern understanding of research didn't exist, so nobody ran a randomized controlled trial in 1832 to see whether this was useful technology or not.
Yes.
And then over 120 odd years, it kind of evolved, and people had a sense of the things that they were listening for that helped them to feel like things were okay, or that things weren't okay. And so it was really well established as being the way that we do things around here. And then CTGs became the new kid on the block. So that's why the two were compared to one another, that intermittent auscultation was already really well established by the time CTGs came, and then very rapidly took over in maternity care. So, how does it compare with CTGs in terms of the outcomes? This is basically the same conversation that we had, but in reverse.
Yes.
So, CTGs compared to intermittent auscultation. Intermittent auscultation does not increase or decrease the mortality rate, the deaths of babies during labour or in the first week of life afterwards. We see the same outcomes regardless of which approach to fetal heart rate monitoring is used. We see the same long-term outcomes in terms of brain injury as well, so cerebral palsy. The only area where we see intermittent auscultation doesn't appear to perform as well is in terms of the neonatal seizure rate, so babies having fits not long after their birth. And as we talked about last time, you need to do quite a lot of CTG monitoring to prevent one baby from having a seizure done. The effect size is quite small, and it's possibly maybe confined only to women who are having their labour sped up with an oxytocin infusion to make their contractions stronger. Again, there's just this big truck-sized holes in the research that just should have been done and never was done before we started going, oh, it's okay, we'll use it this way. That seems like a good idea.
Yes.
Where intermittent auscultation really shines is that it's better for women. And so you don't see the increase in caesarean section rate and the increase in instrumental birth, but you do see a higher spontaneous vaginal birth rate when intermittent auscultation is being used rather than CTG monitoring. And that's true whether we're talking about women who are considered to be low risk or women who are considered to be high risk. And interestingly, in terms of the beneficial effects of CTGs for seizures, that seems to actually be strongest in women who are considered to be low risk, and it actually doesn't reach statistical significance in women who are considered to be high risk, which is kind of the flip side of the way that we actually do things in practice.
Yes.
The group where we maybe have some evidence that they'll do better with CTG use, we don't offer CTGs. We say, oh, you can just have intermittent auscultation, you'll be fine. And the group with there's really, really no evidence that CTG is going to make anything better, the high risk population, we read them the riot act if they dare think that they might have intermittent auscultation instead of CTG use.
Yes.
Just bizarre.
I'm finding myself in increasingly weird conversations where I'm having to say to women, I have to recommend continuous CTG because that's the national guidance, blah, blah, blah. But actually the evidence isn't there. And so if they want to do or have intermittent auscultation, that's fine. And then making them care plans to mean that it's okay for them to make the choice that is obviously evidence says is okay, but just because the guidance doesn't say it's okay. So it's kind of very contradictory. So if you are pregnant listening to this, what would you expect for intermittent auscultation in labour? What would that actually mean?
With intermittent auscultation, most guidelines recommend that somewhere between every 15 minutes to every 30 minutes in the earlier stages of labour, that someone listens to the fetal heart rate for at least 60 seconds, 1 minute. And usually most guidelines say to listen in between contractions. And I'm hoping we get to circle back later and talk about why I think that's probably not a great idea. And you're basically looking for the same information that you would get from the CTG. You know, what's the baseline heart rate? Are there accelerations? Are there decelerations? Is there variability? Does the heart rate bounce up and down? Just, you know, not too much and not, you know, more than not enough, so that you can then make a determination that this fetus is fine, we can leave it alone, or not so happy about this one, we need to pay more attention and possibly take some action to, you know, increase oxygen supply. And if that can't be achieved, then get the baby out where it can be in room air or additional oxygen and be looked after. As labour progresses, then usually as people move into the pushing stage, the second stage of labour, the guidelines say to increase how frequently it's done. So it might be every 5 minutes, or it might be after every contraction or after every second contraction that people are listening. And obviously common sense would dictate if there's a change in what's going on, you know, if there's suddenly some bleeding or the pain changes or the woman's membranes rupture and there's meconium staining, you know, if it's 2 minutes after you just listened, you're not going to go, oh, I'll wait for 28 minutes, I'll be good. You know, you'd step in and you reassess the situation at that stage again to get reassurance that all is well before moving on.
Yeah. So we want to hear the baseline and the variability in accelerations and decelerations. And you mentioned this idea of not listening through a contraction. And I'm interested that you say that, because to me, that sort of makes sense. But obviously, I've got to unpick the fact that that knowledge is coming from what I know happens on a CTG, which we've already agreed isn't necessarily a good thing. But I know that some decelerations are normal during contractions, and it's more about the pace at which they recover and the baseline afterwards and the variability afterwards. You know, is this baby getting progressively hypoxic? Now, that's my assumption from someone that's working with CTG.
I am about
so
to
tell
turn
me,
your world upside down and tell you that is commonly taught.
Yeah.
But if you go and read the physiology research, there's no proof whatsoever that you can distinguish between this kind of deceleration, that kind of deceleration, and the other kind of deceleration, and these ones are okay and these ones are not. All decelerations are due to fetal hypoxia. And you and I were taught as we were junior obstetricians that early decelerations, when the heart rate slows at the same time as the contraction and recovers by the end of it, they're due to head compression and they're harmless. And in some situations, I've actually been taught that they're a reassuring sign that the baby's neurological system is intact. Then there's things called variable decelerations that start and finish at slightly different times, and they look different on a CTG from one contraction to the next. And they're due to the cord being compressed and dropping the baby's blood pressure, and that produces a particular response. And then there's things called late decelerations, and they're the ones that are due to low oxygen, and they start about halfway through the contraction and they take much longer to recover. Turns out that's all nonsense.
Okay, great. So I'm in the world of physiological CTG. I'm going to say inverted commas there. So we now call them baroreceptor D cells and chemoreceptor D cells, but it's the same sort of principle.
If you look
So
at
re-educate me.
If you look at the physiology, for starters, people have done research where they've squeezed fetal heads, either in animal models or in actual human fetuses.
Oh my God.
Where they've done things like putting ring pessaries inside women's vaginas and forcibly pushing up against the fetal head with them. And
wow.
It doesn't reliably produce a deceleration at all. So the whole head compression thing just doesn't hold water.
Okay.
And I have a blog post specifically about that goes through all of that research.
Amazing. I need to go and read that clearly.
There's also been some research questioning whether the baroreceptor reflex is the thing that's responsible for the changes that we see in CTG patterns. And the answer is it isn't. That the only time that you start to see a deceleration is when hypoxia starts. So if you've got a baby that's dropped its blood pressure, but the fetus is adequately oxygenated, you don't get a deceleration. You don't get a drop in the heart rate. It's all low oxygen levels that are doing the changes.
Yes.
And I think what's happened, we are the species who can lie on our backs and look at the sky and see clouds and decide that that one's a giraffe and that one's a teacup.
Yeah, yeah.
We have brains that pick up patterns and make stories out of them. Yeah. And I think that this is a situation where we've picked up some patterns and we've made stories out of them.
Right.
And we've done such a good job of storytelling that we've all believed them. I remember as a registrar being in a CTG education session when one of my fellow registrars, who liked a good joke, and it was back in the days of overhead projectors before PowerPoints existed, because none of us had personal computers or mobile phones because we're old. And what he'd done is he'd taken a blank piece of CTG paper and had photocopied it onto this overhead projector sheet. And then he'd gone and grabbed a graph of a stock exchange report of, the ups and downs of the stock exchange values of a share of a company. Right. And he superimposed one over the top of the other and then drew on what looked like contractions across the bottom of this and presented it to us as a CTG. Everyone in that room for about 10 minutes had a red hot go at classifying that CTG and trying to make it fit the stories that we'd been told, when in fact it was impossible to do so because it wasn't a fetal heart that we were looking at.
That's hilarious.
And I think, and now I look, now knowing what I now know many years later, looking back on that experience, like it should have taught me something at that point in time, that we are so driven to look for patterns and meanings in heart rates that, we have fallen in the trap of seeing things and making nice stories about them without actually really having good research evidence to back that up at all. And it's really only been in the last 10, 15 years that we've started to get the research evidence. Okay. And that shows that all decelerations are due to a thing called the chemoreceptor reflex. So oxygen levels fall. Yeah. There are receptors in some of the blood vessels in our body that recognize that, and they then do a couple of things. So they turn on the sympathetic nervous system, and that redistributes blood. So it contracts blood vessels in parts of the body that aren't frankly that important and can do without it right now. So, your left little toe and your earlobe, and it pushes blood back into the central part of the body so that the brain and the heart gets more of it. So they're protected because that's a good thing to do. You can't see that on a CTG, but it's going on. The other thing that happens is that in order to protect the heart, you want it to do less work. And so you turn on the parasympathetic nervous system via the vagus nerve and you drop the heart rate dramatically. Because if it goes from beating 120 times a minute to 60 times a minute, it only needs half as much oxygen. So it can get by literally with half as much oxygen and function exactly as well. So when people talk about fetal distress, what we're actually seeing is fetal coping. It's not as sexy though, because, pressing the big button on the wall and running screaming up a corridor to the operating theatre because your fetus is coping just doesn't have the same ring to it. But, we've gotten caught up in this story that what we're seeing is sign of impending doom for this child rather than a valid coping mechanism that's actually designed to prevent damage from low oxygen levels. The problem is that we don't have a heart rate signal that will tell us when we've gone from my oxygen level's low, I've made all these adjustments, I'm brilliant now, I'm great, I can keep going, and a fetus that's made all of the adjustments and they are not enough, and there's now starting to be damage to the brain or to the heart. The heart rate patterns look the same. And that's precisely that we need something that can tell those two apart for some form of fetal monitoring to work in labour, because otherwise we see what we see in clinical practice, and that is that we end up doing lots of caesarean sections and instrumental births and telling people to push harder and cutting episiotomies because we see patterns on the heart rate. The baby's completely fine, comes out yelling its lungs off a few minutes later and says, what did you do that for? I was okay. And yet we also sometimes miss babies that would have benefited from earlier birth because we put them in the, they're probably okay category when they're not. And so not really solving the problem, which is why I think the Pinard and how the heart rate changes sound. Yeah. Because if you're not getting enough oxygen levels to actually continue to have your heart squeeze blood out hard, even though it's dropped its heart rate to protect itself, that's a sign you've shifted across the line. And you can hear that if you know what you're listening for with a Pinard stethoscope. Yes. The one bit of research that has started to look hopeful is a thing called the total deceleration area or total deceleration time. Right. Which basically adds up the amount of time the baby's heart rate stays below the baseline, the average heart rate. So you can either have a smaller number of really long, really deep decelerations that then add up to a much larger number of really small, short decelerations. And that would give us the same information, that those fetuses are both in the same condition. So therefore, given that almost all decelerations happen during contractions, it becomes really important that we know what's going on during contractions, because if you're having consistent decelerations that recover by the time the contraction's finished, if the only time that you're listening with your intermittent auscultation is, 10 or 15 seconds after the woman's gone, oh, that was a big one, okay, you can listen now, you won't know that those decelerations are happening. And so you'll lose really vital information, which I think potentially becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy there, because people go, well, intermittent auscultation doesn't work. It can't pick up the ones that are, well, that's because you're not looking for the right information. Right. You're ignoring the one time in the contraction cycle when that heart rate might actually be providing you with the most information. Like it's jolly uncomfortable to have someone listen to the fetal heart rate with a Doppler during contractions. And it does mean that, if you want to sway and stomp and what have you, either you need an agile midwife who can follow you around and sway and stomp and do it at the same pace, or you have to be still while somebody's listening. So it's a bit of a pest. But I do think that paying more attention during contractions is something that we should incorporate in our guidelines and our thinking when we're using intermittent auscultation for that reason.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying, and you've probably not blown my mind quite as much as you think, because we talk about gradually evolving hypoxia. So the baby's decelerating, but it's coming back to its normal baseline and it's all good. And what we're looking for is that moment that you've described where actually it's now shifting to, it was coping, it's coping. And then actually this is the point where it's going to start to decompensate and not cope as well. And so I'm now going to say, so we've listened in the contractions, great, and we've heard a deceleration or decelerations. And now what are we going to do? Because the thing immediately that would happen in my birth center would be, we've heard a
put a CTG
deceleration.
on.
Let's put the CTG on. So now now that we're back in that sticky thing, but the CTG doesn't make a difference. So I'm like, now we're stuck.
There's not been a research trial where the only entry criteria was women who had an abnormal heart rate pattern on auscultation, and then we keep going with intermittent auscultation, or we keep going with CTGs, because that, in the days before CTGs were invented, of course people kept going with intermittent auscultation. It was the only tool they had available. So there is a point in history when that was done and people found ways to continue to gather useful information. We do have some of the so-called high-risk trials that are included in the Cochrane Review, where women who had some kind of risk factor were randomised either to intermittent auscultation or CTG monitoring. One of the criteria, and almost all of those trials had multiple criteria that got you across the line in terms of being called high risk, but one of the criteria was abnormal heart rates on auscultation, and yet they still randomised people to intermittent auscultation and still got outcomes that were equivalent to CTG use.
Right.
Now, it might be that those women actually did, that those women's fetuses did a lot worse, but the women who had diabetes did so much better with intermittent auscultation, and therefore they kind of cancelled each other out. Who knows? We haven't got that kind of fine-grained detailed in the research, but there's no compelling research out there that says that you have to put a CTG on when you hear the heart rates abnormal. And I think in real life, in a real clinical situation, I think this is hugely context dependent. Depends on what the clinical situation is, how rapidly it's unfolding, how many sets of hands you've got on deck, where the equipment is. And, what really needs to happen is adequate assessment of the woman and her fetus, an appropriate decision making. And you use the best set of tools that you have at your disposal at the time to do that. So if you're in a place where there's a CTG machine fixed to the wall next to the bed and the equipment is in the top drawer and it's always available, but you're a bit short on staff, and when you press the buzzer no one comes, then putting the CTG on to free up your hands so that you can then go on and do all the other, do the vaginal examination and do the maternal observations and those other things that need doing, then that makes sense. If you're in a situation where the CTG machine is in another room and the straps are locked up in the drug cupboard and the midwife who's got the keys is on a tea break, and there's 3 of you that are in the birth room, then it might actually make sense just to keep going with really frequent intermittent auscultation, basically continuous auscultation with somebody holding the Doppler on, and it's their job just to continue listening while all of those other things happen around you. And it's more, because of the way we structure our maternity care systems, it's more common that we'll be short on staff but heavy on equipment. And so it makes logical sense to go down let's put the CTG machine on. But, I kind of hope people would think through that rationally and not leave a woman alone and go and find the CTG machine and the midwife, when really what needs to happen is a rapid clinical assessment of the situation, because they become rules-based and the rule says you have to put a CTG on, instead of thinking about what's really happening here and what's the best way for me to solve this problem.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I was thinking about home birth or birth centre where a CTG machine is not available, and actually, if birth is imminent, or you can do things safely and continue monitoring and make that full clinical assessment, then it may be that you don't need to move, you don't need to necessarily change what you're doing. You've just got an awareness that this baby may need some assistance when it's born, or may need something slightly different doing to expedite birth, changing the woman's position or whatever it is, or may need transfer, but you can make that clinical assessment first and decide. And that sort of brings me to, we sometimes have started referring to intermittent auscultation as intelligent auscultation. And I think, yes, that's not quite correct, because it's all about what you're describing, listening in, but it is then about engaging your brain and thinking, what does this mean in the context in which I'm listening?
The other thing that's worth reminding people of is, if we go back to the conversation that we had last time about the idea that CTG monitoring is continuous monitoring, and I'm using air quotes while I'm saying that, because in reality it's actually intermittent monitoring but continuous recording. People don't look at the machine. They might vaguely be aware of the heart rate ticking away in the background, but in terms of actually stopping and engaging with the CTG trace and actively interpreting it and making meaning of it, that happens intermittently. When you're doing intermittent auscultation, that analysis and interpretation is happening at the same time that you are actively listening to it. And so if you're actively listening over the space of 1, 2, or 3 minutes and going, I do not like what I'm hearing, and then you need to stop because you've got to do the blood pressure and you've got to press the buzzer and you've got to do 7 other things, it's actually not dissimilar to what's happening with CTG monitoring. And yet people tell themselves this kind of story that there's somehow more contemporaneous oversight over the heart rate when the CTG is on. It's not actually true. What's happening is it's retrospective analysis of it after the event has already passed, when you look back at the last 15 or 20 minutes while you've been running around doing all the things that needed doing to sort out the clinical situation.
Yes.
So then they're not as diametrically opposed as we might think that they are in clinical practice. The intelligent intermittent auscultation stuff's interesting. I haven't actually seen the inside of any of that. It's UK based, so it's not available to me here. And the devil's in the details with these things. So I would quite like to get a handle on it. But what used to happen when I was training, and even in the early years of my practice, was that people they'd listen strictly every 15 or 30 minutes or every 5 minutes, or after, depending on what the guidelines in the hospital said, for 60 seconds. They'd calculate the baseline heart rate and they'd reduce it down to a single number, and then they'd go and find the partogram where we record all of the labour observations, and they'd put a little X so that it sat at 125 at 10:30 a.m. and then at 11 a.m. they'd put another little X at 130, and that was it. And it's not enough. It's not good enough to just record one single number every half an hour. And again, if you then compare it to CTG monitoring, well, of course, that looks like completely deficient monitoring. And I think it sets up a situation where people are asking themselves the wrong question. They're asking, what's the heart rate? Not, have I got enough information right now about what's going on for this fetus to tell me that it's okay for me to leave it exactly the way that it is and not do anything different? And it's a very different mindset, and that might require listening for a lot longer. I'll listen through the next contraction. I'll give the woman a bit of a break for the one after that, and then I'll listen again to the one after that, because I'm still not quite sure what I'm hearing, to increase the intensity of that until I get to a point where I'm ready to make a decision that, in fact, this is okay and I can back off and, wait another 15 minutes, or no, it's not okay and I've got to call for help and we've got to do something different about the situation here. And it concerns me when people write these guidelines that say thou shalt listen every, for X seconds for every so many minutes at this point in lab. And it's easy to follow the rules and lose sight of the reason why they exist in the first place.
Yes, I think that's very true. And I've had some conversations with our fetal monitoring midwife about how you do this, and listening for a minute, or do you listen in blocks of 15 seconds? She was talking about this Oxford method that's being described, where you listen for 15-second blocks for 90 seconds, and then you've got to do complex maths in your head. What I see in the notes much more is the single number, on the partogram, or written in the notes, the single number. which is interesting because in the antenatal clinic these days, we tend to write down a range, or if, for example, it's somewhere in going around between 140 and 150, we will write down it's in the 140s. You know, that's that baby's normal baseline, but we won't write down just 140.
142.
Yeah, exactly, or 142.
Which, as you know, it's really tricky to actually arrive at that number, because if you're using one of the modern Dopplers that has the little screen on it and the computer brain in it that gives you a number, it doesn't sit at 140 or 142 for 60 seconds. It's like that for 3 seconds, and then another couple of heartbeats later it's 148, and then it's 152, and then it's 136. So you're just having a bit of a wild guess to try and arrive
which is
at
where
that
your
baseline number,
which is where your brain comes in again, isn't it? Because are we unconsciously selecting the numbers that we like? It's a bit like, I'm going off track now, but blood pressure machines. So when we did blood pressure with a sphig, it was much more likely that you're going to pick the blood pressure numbers that are an even number, aren't they? So it's always going to be, because that's where the lines are. That's where the lines are. Whereas now, if you take it on an electronic machine, it might be, 103 on 57, and you would never ever have made that someone's blood pressure when you were doing it manually. So I feel like this could be a bit the same. Do we pick numbers that we think are okay out of the numbers that are flashing before us? And how are we thinking about that? And then also the numbers, as we've said, are computer generated anyway. So lots to think about, but definitely in the notes, I see people have written a single number. And then I also see, if we're doing a review of care, because maybe, there's been a risk incident, which may or may not be to do with the baby, I'll see midwives criticise because, well, they didn't do every 15 minutes. Well, actually, all it is they didn't write it down every 15 minutes. Maybe this one was 10 minutes apart. This one was 17 minutes apart. This one was 8 minutes apart. This one was 20 minutes apart. Well, again, it's back to that sort of rules thing. Yes, we want good practice, but getting back to is this baby okay at this point in time with what's happening to it? That's the key.
Yeah. I would like to see something that looks a bit like this. When a woman first presents for professional care in labour, that there's something kind of like what happens with an admission CTG, but using intermittent auscultation instead. So you ask the woman, is your baby moving at the moment? If the answer is no, then you have a listen in between contractions long enough for you to get an idea of what the baseline is, because that, for a baseline, it needs to be in between contractions and when there's no active fetal movement, there's no acceleration in progress. And you work out your baseline and you look at as I just said, you look at the numbers on the screen, and if it's going from 132 to 142 and anywhere in between, well, that's 10 beats of variability. So you've got normal variability going on. So you can record that in the same way that you would if you were interpreting in CTG. And then you say to the woman, look, tell me the next time your baby moves. And so she says, oh, it's having a kick, and you have a listen and it's 168. So there's your acceleration. And then you have a listen through the next contraction all the way through beginning end and out the other end, and there is no deceleration. And so that might require you to listen for, a 5-minute period across a 15-minute period, starting and stopping, to get the same kind of information that you would get with a CTG. It's very different to just, 60 seconds in between contractions and we're done, and we're not going to listen now for another half an hour. Because if you've then got that robust, and you can stand up and say, Your Honour, in a court of law, this is exactly what I did to ensure that this fetus was in good health at the time that I initiated professional care for this woman, then, no one's really going to have too much room to criticise that. And then if that's well, and the clinical situation's really stable, and it's early labour, nothing much is going to change. So if you don't listen for 45 minutes, probably no great big deal. But, if the woman ruptures the membranes and starts making a different noise, then you don't want to sit there looking at your clock going, oh, I've got another 15 minutes. That's the time when, again, you step up and you listen more intently, and you might do, 4 periods of intermittent auscultation back to back over the course of 5 contractions, listening at different times until you can reassure yourself once again that this is okay. And I'm happy to, now we'll wait 15 minutes before the next time we have a listen.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to translate into guidelines because guideline writers like simple rules, and you can do what you said then in the reviews afterwards. Well, it was 12 minutes, not 15.
Yeah.
It was 16 minutes and 52 seconds, not 15. But
yeah,
that doesn't necessarily constitute poor care.
No, exactly. But I really like that approach that you just outlined. I think that would be a really good way forward. And I think I'm hoping that women that are listening to this, that gives them confidence that it's okay to choose intermittent auscultation. And I think women sometimes, probably from us as professionals, get this idea that it's not monitoring, as we discussed when we spoke last time. And actually it is monitoring. It is assessing how your baby's doing.
It's the same fetal heart.
Yeah.
It's the same set of fetal heart rate patterns. If you're comparing a handheld Doppler with a Doppler-based CTG, it's literally the same technology that's being used to provide you with the information. So, ergo, it is actually not all that surprising when you sit down and think about it that we see very little difference in outcomes between the two of them, because, and as I said, it might be continuous recording. It's still intermittent monitoring when you're using a CTG. You're still only interrogating and interpreting and making a decision about the quality and the meaning of that trace intermittently, the same as you're doing when you're listening intermittently with a Doppler through contraction. So it's actually not that surprising that the two of them rank really similarly in the research. So I think the take-home messages I would have for women who are accessing maternity care is that it's actually okay to question the idea that you have to have a CTG because insert risk factor here, you're having a VBAC, you're having twins, you're a bit overdue, whatever. And obviously, that needs to be an individualised discussion that you should have with your care provider, because some situations are, really pretty scary and would make even my eyelids twitch at the thought of not accessing CTG monitoring, particularly when people are using oxytocin infusions. That one kind of, I feel very uncomfortable about not having CTG monitoring on, and that's more for the T bit of the CTG, so being able to tell what's happening with contraction patterns. And that if it is done intelligently by somebody who's asking the right questions, then you should expect exactly the same outcomes that we see with CTG use. Apart from the fact that in the research we see high spontaneous vaginal birth rates, and I think that's more complicated than it's just because we're not seeing a whole pile of scary things on the CTG. We just don't have access to information that would trigger a response. I think that's part of it, but I think it's more complicated than that. There's something materially different about the intimacy of the care that's involved in laying hands on a regular basis. A midwife has to be in the room. They have to have laid hands on that woman's abdomen to have a rough idea of where that fetus is lying, to know where to listen, and it will change during the course of the labour, so they'll need to get hands on again with the woman. You are up close with people. You can smell when they start getting ketotic because they're a bit dehydrated and haven't had anything, a jelly bean in the last 7 hours. You can feel that they're hot, and before you think to do a set of observations and find out that they've got a fever. If you've whacked the CTG on and you've wandered out to the central monitoring station to have your cup of tea on your meal break and the woman's alone in the room, you miss all the rest of that information at the same time. And I think, that the reassuring human presence of somebody who's not stressed helps to regulate your heart rate, and that probably helps regulate the fetal heart rate. And there's some safety information that's also being picked up by the active involvement of a midwife or obstetric nurse, depending on which country you're in, who's doing the intermittent auscultation that's missed, particularly when you've got central fetal monitoring systems and people are absent from the room.
I think that's sort of perfect message, really, both for women and those of us working in maternity. And it would be really great if, having had this conversation, spurred people on to use intermittent auscultation in some of the ways we've discussed, and get a bit more thoughtful about whether actually they do need a CCG or not, and that kind of overall clinical picture and being, with women.
Seems like a good point to end a podcast on.
It does, doesn't it? Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much for joining me again. It's been an absolute pleasure. And just like last time, I've really enjoyed our thought-provoking conversation. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me back to finish off the second half of the conversation.
I very much hope you found this episode of the OBS Pod interesting. If you have, it'd be fantastic if you could subscribe, rate and review on whatever platform you find your podcasts, as well as recommending the OBS Pod to anyone you think might find it interesting. There's also tons of episodes to explore in my back catalogue, from clinical topics, my career and journey as an obstetrician, and life in the NHS more generally. I'd like to assure women I care for that I take confidentiality very seriously and take great care not to use any patient identifiable information unless I have expressly asked the permission of the person involved, on that rare occasion when it's been absolutely necessary. If you found this episode interesting and want to explore the subject a little more deeply, don't forget to take a look at the programme notes where I've attached some links. If you want to get in touch to suggest topics for future episodes, you can find me at the OBSPod on Twitter and Instagram, and you can email me theobspod@gmail.com. Finally, it's very important to me to keep the OBSPod free and accessible to as many people as possible. But it does cost me a very small amount to keep it going and keep it live on the internet. So if you've enjoyed my episodes and by chance you do have a tiny bit to spare, you can now contribute to keep the podcast going and keep it free via my link to buy me a coffee. Don't feel under any obligation, but if you'd like to contribute, you now can. Thank you for listening.